Immigration has a positive and statistically significant impact on the economic performance of the economies of the receiving countries, in this case South Africa. Further, immigration tends to reduce unemployment. I repeat, it has the effect of reducing unemployment, not increasing it.
South Africa has 8.1 million officially unemployed people. The unemployment rate is 32.7%. Among people between 15 and 24 years old, it is above 60%. And into this national emergency steps one of the most powerful business leaders in the country, made an extraordinary claim. He said migrants are not increasing unemployment. They may actually be reducing it. Tshabalala did not mention Jacinta Ngobese-Zuma. He did not name March and March, but his argument lands directly at the center of the movement's economic message. March and March says South African citizens are losing opportunities while companies employ undocumented foreign workers. Its own website presents the movement as defending opportunities for citizens and highlights campaigns accusing businesses of hiring undocumented migrants as cheap labor. Does it somebody has misunderstood the South African economy? Is it the movement telling citizens that foreign workers are taking their jobs? Or is it the banking executive looking at national statistics from a corporate boardroom? The evidence gives Tshabalala a stronger case than many critics will admit, but it does not prove everything he appears to suggest. And the weakness in his argument becomes clearer when we separate three questions that South Africa keeps mixing together. Do migrants benefit the economy nationally? Can foreign workers compete with citizens in particular jobs? And are undocumented workers being used by employers to avoid South African labour standards? Those are not the same question. But listen to this.
Migrants are not only workers, they're also consumers. They're tenants, they're commuters, they're savers, they're borrowers, they're traders, and they're entrepreneurs. They increase the demand for goods as well as the supply of labor. They rent rooms, they buy food, they use transport, they pay school fees, they start small businesses, and they create jobs for local people.
This is the strongest part of Tshabalala's case. The popular argument often assumes that South Africa possesses a fixed number of jobs. Under that assumption, when a migrant gets one job, a South African automatically loses one. But an economy does not work like a row of chairs in which every new arrival must remove somebody already seated. Also, a migrant worker needs accommodation. That creates income for a landlord. The migrant buys food, pays taxi fares, repairs a phone, sends children to school, and purchases goods from wholesalers and retailers. A migrant entrepreneur may rent commercial space, buy stock, hire workers, and create another link in the supply chain. The person therefore adds to the supply of labor, but also to the demand that keeps other people employed. That does not guarantee that every migrant creates jobs. It means the economic effect cannot be calculated by counting foreign workers and assuming that every one of them displaced a citizen. Here is what the South African evidence found. The first major surprise is that South African research broadly supports Tshabalala. A World Bank study examining the period from 1996 to 2011 found that immigrant workers had a positive effect on the employment and wages of South Africans. Its model associated each immigrant worker with approximately 2 jobs for citizens. The researchers argued that foreign and South African workers were often performing complementary tasks rather than functioning as perfect substitutes. They also found that migrants were more likely to be self-employed, with self-employment accounting for 25% of migrant employment, compared with 16% among locals. An OECD and International Labour Organization study reached a similar broad conclusion. It found that immigration was not associated with a reduction in the employment rate of South African-born people. It also concluded that migrants increased income per person and made a positive contribution to the government's fiscal balance. So, when Tshabalala challenges the simple claim that foreigners have entered South Africa, and removed an equal number of jobs from citizens, he is not merely expressing a corporate opinion. There is evidence behind him. But now comes the qualification that should have appeared more clearly in his speech. The World Bank findings cover 1996 to 2011. The researchers themselves warned that the results were retrospective because of data limitations. They also acknowledged that migration may create short-term costs for particular communities. That distinction matters enormously. A positive national average does not mean every worker benefits. Imagine that migrant-owned businesses create jobs across Gauteng, increase demand for transport and support wholesalers. At the same time, undocumented workers in one restaurant district may be accepting wages below the legal standard because their status makes them easier to exploit. The national effect could remain positive while a particular South African waiter still loses an opportunity. Both experiences can be real. A 2025 meta-analysis of 41 studies and 1,459 estimates found that immigration had a statistically significant positive effect on economic performance on average. But it also found major differences across countries, periods, types of migrants, and methods of measurement. Only 4 of the studies focused exclusively on developing countries, while 29 examined developed economies. Therefore, the researchers warned against turning an average international finding into a universal conclusion for every national context. Tshabalala's first sentence closely reflects that broader meta-analysis. But an international average is not the same thing as a real-time audit of South Africa's labour market in 2026. That does not make his conclusion false. It makes his certainty stronger than the available evidence. To assess the opposing position fairly, we must not reduce March and March's argument to the claim that every foreign person is taking a job. The March and March movement publicly says its campaign is directed at illegal immigration. It wants employers investigated for hiring undocumented workers and argues that citizens should receive priority where South Africans are qualified and available. Jacinta Ngobese-Zuma has specifically criticised employment practices in restaurants, farming, fuel stations, trucking, clothing, e-hailing, and the township economy. She argues that some employers benefit from undocumented labour while citizens remain unemployed. This is narrower than the claim Tshabalala is answering. Tshabalala speaks about migrants as an economic population. March and March speaks most forcefully about undocumented workers and non-compliant employers. One asks whether migration benefits the economy overall. The other asks whether individual companies are replacing citizens with vulnerable foreign workers who can be paid less or denied labour protections. These arguments can collide, but they are not exact opposites. And this is where much of South Africa's debate becomes intellectually dishonest. Supporters of migration sometimes use national economic gains to dismiss every local complaint. Anti-migration movements sometimes use examples of unlawful employment to blame millions of people for a national unemployment crisis they did not create. Both shortcuts conceal the role of the employer. Because when a company deliberately employs an undocumented person to avoid fair wages, the first lawbreaker is not simply the worker trying to survive. It is the employer using legal vulnerability as a business model. South Africa's government has acknowledged this problem and has intensified workplace inspections against companies suspected of employing undocumented foreign nationals. It also insists that immigration enforcement remains the responsibility of authorised state institutions, not private movements. So the policy answer cannot be to pretend unlawful employment does not exist, nor can it be to treat every migrant worker as evidence of criminality. The answer is enforcement against exploitative employers, reliable documentation and labour standards that protect South African and foreign workers from being played against each other. But listen to this.
We should also say clearly that migrants also pay tax. Those are that are in the formal system will pay tax by way of employment taxes. Those that are outside the system will buy food, they buy petrol, they buy goods, they will pay VAT and thereby contribute to the tax system. And so the claim that they have a diminution on the government's ability to serve citizens is not true. It is not supported by the data either.
His first point is straightforward. A documented migrant in formal employment may pay income-related taxes. A migrant purchasing food, clothing, fuel, or household goods pays consumption taxes whether that person possesses South African citizenship or not. This is one reason the OECD ILO study found a positive overall fiscal contribution from migrants. But Tshabalala then moves from a defensible point to an overly absolute one. Showing that migrants pay taxes does not prove that migration can never place pressure on public services. Tax revenue is collected through national systems. Pressure is often experienced locally. A clinic in a fast-growing settlement does not automatically receive more doctors because consumption has increased nationally. A school does not instantly gain classrooms because a larger population is paying VAT. A municipality can experience population growth, while budgets, planning data, and infrastructure remain years behind. That is not evidence that migrants caused South Africa's failing services. It is evidence that economic contribution and local service pressure can exist at the same time. The government itself acknowledges that unchecked irregular migration can add pressure to healthcare, education, security, and border systems. It also insists that those pressures cannot justify prejudice or private intimidation. So, Tshabalala is right to reject the claim that migrants contribute nothing. He is less convincing when he suggests that their impact on state capacity is simply disproved. The better question is not whether migrants pay taxes. It is whether government measures population movement accurately and directs resources to the communities experiencing the growth. However, take a listen.
Let's move to MNCs. Ralph and I work for two great multinational companies. We are stewards at these companies. And we rely on the South African national competitive advantage to run our businesses. There are other examples, great companies, Goldfields, Sasol, Vodacom, Absa, First Rand, Shoprite, Spar, Aspen, MultiChoice. The number of companies operating outside South Africa is long and vast. There really is a lot at stake.
Now the argument changes. Tshabalala is no longer talking only about a migrant renting a room or opening a shop. He is talking about the continental position of South African corporations. That matters because South African banks, telecommunications companies, retailers, mining businesses, and media groups earn substantial revenue in the same African countries whose citizens are being told they are an economic burden inside South Africa. Listen to what Tshabalala says about it.
In the case of Standard Bank, we made 49 billion rand last year. Of that 49 billion rand, 19.7, roughly 40%, was generated outside South Africa. We pay around 10.3 billion rand in taxes outside South Africa and 7.7 billion here in South Africa. And so we are a truly African financial institution, as is the case with MTN. But for us to succeed, we rely on the trust and the reciprocity and the legitimacy in the countries where we operate,
Standard Bank's official results confirm total headline earnings of R49.2 billion for 2025. Its Africa region's businesses generated R19.7 billion, representing 40% of group earnings. Ghana and Nigeria were among the major contributors to that continental performance. This does not prove that migrants reduce unemployment in South Africa. A bank earning money in Ghana is not the same economic question as a Zimbabwean worker seeking employment in Johannesburg. But Tshabalala is making a second argument. South Africa cannot demand access, goodwill, and commercial legitimacy across Africa while treating African mobility only as a threat at home. Reciprocity runs in both directions, and the warning is no longer theoretical. Ghana requested that the treatment of African nationals in South Africa be discussed by the African Union. Nigeria raised the safety of its citizens through diplomatic and parliamentary channels. South Africa has had to defend its conduct before continental partners, while promising that immigration enforcement will remain lawful and that foreign nationals will be protected. Therefore, Standard Bank has an obvious commercial interest in opposing rhetoric that damages South Africa's standing across Africa. That interest should be disclosed, though commercial interest does not automatically invalidate his evidence. A doctor can profit from medicine and still correctly diagnose an illness. The proper response is to examine the argument, not dismiss the speaker. Is this corporate South Africa protecting its African profits? That suspicion will be difficult to avoid. March and March supporters may hear Tshabalala's speech and conclude that a powerful banker is defending the African markets that generated billions for his institution, while unemployed South Africans are told to accept more competition. That reaction is understandable, but it also raises a difficult counter-question. Would South Africans be better off if hostility toward African nationals triggered retaliation against South African banks, retailers, telecommunications companies, and workers elsewhere on the continent? If South African corporations lose markets, investment, and legitimacy in Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, or Zambia, who eventually loses employment at home? The receptionist, driver, cleaner, analyst, and call center worker inside South Africa may depend indirectly on profits earned beyond its borders. This is why the migration conflict can no longer be treated as a purely domestic shouting match. It affects employment inside South Africa. It affects migrants living in the country, and it affects South African commercial interests throughout the continent. So is Tshabalala right? On the broad national claim, I think the evidence leans strongly in his direction. There is no convincing basis for saying that migrants, as a single group, caused South Africa's unemployment crisis. Research has found positive effects on employment, entrepreneurship, wages, and public finances. Migrants do not merely compete for work. They also consume, invest, and create demand. However, his speech becomes less convincing when the national conclusion is treated as though it resolves every local dispute. A migrant can contribute positively to the economy while still competing with a South African in a particular occupation. A migrant-owned business can create employment while another business displaces a local competitor. Migrants can pay taxes while a clinic, school, or municipality experiences real population pressure. And the economy can benefit from migration while individual employers illegally exploit undocumented workers. As such, March and March is not wrong to demand enforcement against unlawful employment. It is wrong when specific abuses are transformed into a sweeping story in which migrants become the explanation for a jobs crisis rooted far more deeply in slow economic growth, weak education, infrastructure failure, corruption, low investment, and ineffective government. South Africa's economy grew far too slowly for years to generate the millions of jobs its people need. The World Bank identifies weak growth, infrastructure constraints, and inefficient institutions as major barriers to employment creation. Removing every migrant tomorrow would not repair Eskom. It would not restore freight rail. It would not fix municipal government. It would not train millions of unemployed young people. And it would not force employers to pay lawful wages. However, ignoring undocumented employment would not solve those problems either. The honest position demands both economic evidence and state enforcement. Protect citizens from labour exploitation. Protect migrants from collective blame. Secure the borders. punish employers who violate immigration and labour laws, and grow the economy so that desperation no longer turns neighbours into enemies. Tshabalala says migrants do not take South Africans' jobs. He says they create demand, pay taxes and help reduce unemployment. March says citizens are being excluded while employers benefit from undocumented foreign labour. The evidence suggests that Tshabalala is broadly right about the economy, but it also suggests that national averages cannot be used to silence every community experiencing unlawful employment, weak services, or poor enforcement. So, where do you stand? Is Tshabalala confronting one of South Africa's most dangerous economic myths? Or is corporate South Africa using broad statistics to avoid the realities experienced by unemployed citizens? And is the real enemy the migrant worker, or the state and employer that allow South African and foreign workers to be exploited against each other? This is the South Africa File. History, power, politics, consequences. Share your position in the comments, but challenge the argument rather than attacking nationalities. Subscribe and join us as we follow the evidence wherever it leads.